FNAF's infamous Shadow Animatronics. Numerous characters that appear all throughout the franchise whose lore is extremely important, yet still shrouded in so much mystery. These shadows first started appearing back in FNAF 2, but are still appearing in modern day. So what actually are the shadows? How many are there? What are they doing around in modern day? And why are there so many Nightmarionne plushies? Well, today I think I have an answer to all of that and more. So subscribe to the channel if you're new and turn on notifications, like the video and consider becoming a channel member if you enjoy. Remember, this is all just a theory and my interpretation of the evidence. And before we begin, on the 16th of August, 2 PM EST, I'll be on Game Theory, talking FNAF lore alongside Dorko, FNAF, ID's Fantasy, and Rytoast. So please make sure to be there, it'll be a ton of fun, and please cheer me on because I am so nervous. But either way, let's get into today's theory. First, let's talk about who is classified as a Shadow Animatronic, to figure out just how many we're dealing with here. First of all, we know of Shadow Freddy, modelled after Withered Golden Freddy, and RWQFSFASXC, Shadow Bunny for short, modelled after Toy Bunny. The first two shadows that originated back in FNAF 2 as rare chance Easter eggs. Neither would actually kill you, but instead if you stared too long, your game would simply crash. Then FNAF 3 rolled around, Shadow Freddy appearing in the gameplay portions as a rare crumpled suit Easter egg, being called Shadow Freddy in the files, and the suit's true colour being purple once you colour correct the intense screen lighting into white, as well as appearing in the Follow Me end of night minigames, luring the FNAF 1 animatronics back to the safe room and therefore back into William's joyful hands. Shadow Bunny, however, appears in one of the hidden minigames, Glitch, on your path to the happiest day, where you use it to, well, glitch through the previous minigames, eventually giving a child their cake. Then in FNAF 4, Shadow Freddy appears as the infamous Nightmare, similar to FNAF 3, the Nightmare mode being dubbed Shadow Freddy in the files, and the two both get referenced with a shadow coming from Fredbear and Spring Bunny being the exact same colour of Shadow Bunny in the Glitch minigame. Neither appear in sister location, while both are then referenced in the opening minigame of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, FNAF 6, with a golden bear eventually being shadowed with a darkened bear that also eventually glitches out. Both then actually return in Ultimate Custom Night, Shadow Freddy via Nightmare and Shadow Bunny as an antagonist spawned by dee-dee's shadow form XOR. In the modern games, Shadow Freddy is referenced in Help Wanted with Blacklight Freddy, although it's unclear if we can count this as an official appearance, while Shadow Bunny appears as the main antagonist in FNAF AR Special Delivery, and later appearing as a cutout character in Security Breach. Besides those two, we then got a character called Nightmarionne, which replaces Nightmare in FNAF 4's Halloween edition. And while Scott has confirmed the gameplay of the Halloween edition is not canon, Nightmarionne did later appear in canon through Ultimate Custom Night, Help Wanted, and Security Breach with his numerous plushies found everywhere throughout the Pizzaplex. I believe Nightmarionne is meant to be a Shadow Agony creature just like the rest, due to not only literally replacing Shadow Freddy and sharing his exact same characteristics, but his voice line in Ultimate Custom Night,
I am the fearful reflection of what you have created,
which is a parallel to Nightmare's voice line, as well as its naming convention with it literally being called Nightmarionne instead of Nightmare Puppet, like it should be like everyone else in the game, which is likely because Nightmarionne is really Nightmare Shadow Puppet, replacing Nightmare, which is really Nightmare Shadow Freddy, and Nightmarionne later being referenced as just Nightmare with its plushies. As we mentioned earlier, in Ultimate Custom Night, dee-dee has a shadow form named XOR that gets officially dubbed as Shadow dee-dee in both the Ultimate Guide and the Character Encyclopedia. Speaking of the Character Encyclopedia though, that's also where we get told that these sprites in the FNAF 3 minigames are actually meant to be shadow variants of the characters, such as the Shadow Cupcakes, the Shadow Puppet, and Shadow Balloon Boy. Then finally in Help Wanted we get introduced to a shadowed Mangle called Blacklight Mangle, who then gets dubbed in the Ultimate Guide as Shadow Mangle, likely meaning that Blacklight Freddy may actually be an appearance of Shadow Freddy after all, which isn't a stretch when Shadow Bunny is also around at this point in time. Therefore, in total we have about 8 shadows. So now that we know the amount, what on earth is a shadow? Well, to learn that, we look at a surprising place, but one where a shadow takes center stage. FNAF AR Special Delivery. Within FNAF AR, there's a Remnant collection section where you, well, collect Remnant. Although around the Remnant orbs are darker orbs that you might accidentally pick up in the process, eventually collecting too many in order to spawn Shadow Bunny. These dark orbs are likely meant to be Agony, which to define in the simplest way possible, as we learn through multiple sources in the FNAF universe, if there's a large amount of emotional agony generated generated, mainly due to a tragedy, that agony can then actually infect a nearby object and cause it to appear haunted without even having a specific spirit tied to it or a soul attached. This agony in extreme cases can even go on to manifest itself into an agony being, as we see in this very game, where collecting too much agony eventually causes Shadow Bunny to manifest. This idea also perfectly correlates to another place Shadow Bunny takes center stage, the Fazbear Fright story Hide and Seek. Within this story, Shadow Bunny is originally just a cardboard cutout character in a hide-and-seek attraction, simply being called a black-shadowed bunny, that eventually manifests itself into a real creature due to the pure agony and rage that the main protagonist, Toby, inflicts onto the attraction after losing. It growing more and more as the story progresses due to Toby continuing to inflict rage and agony onto those around him, basically feeding him power. And then once Toby finally lets go of his agony and admits, "You win, you beat me, I give up, I don't care anymore," Shadow Bunny then completely disappears, only for Toby to then return to the attraction with more rage and agony, claiming that Bunny cheated, causing Shadow Bunny to immediately reappear as monstrous as ever. So with Scott telling us that the Fazbear Fright series is meant to fill in some blanks that we had in the original story, as well as FNAF AR most explicitly showing it to us visually, it seems extremely likely that the shadows that we see through the story are creatures generated from the agony of select tragedies. But then, which tragedies created which shadows? Starting with Shadow Freddy, and as I mentioned earlier, he's specifically modeled after Withered Golden Freddy, which would simply imply that he's tied to the agony that came from an incident specifically involving Golden Freddy, or its former self, Fredbear. This is then further backed with FNAF 4, where he takes the role of Nightmare, a direct shadow of Nightmare Fredbear, as well as FNAF 6, where we specifically see a Golden Bear be shadowed. As we know from the lore, Golden Freddy was involved in two major tragedies before FNAF 2, the Bite of 83 at the hands of Fredbear, and the Missing Children's Incident, MCI for short, where Cassidy was stuffed into the Golden Freddy suit, and likely spring-locked inside. With a consistent relevancy to Golden Freddy specifically, including Nightmare shadowing a version of Fredbear with a giant stomach mouth, referencing the memory of the bite, FNAF World having Shadow Freddy be modeled with what appears to be a broken jaw, again referencing the bite, and the FNAF movie having a character who gets picked up and chomped, also referencing the bite, gets stuffed into a purple Shadow Freddy suit, it appears likely that he was created from the agony that came from the crying child's death in the Bite of 83. Although that likely theory then loses a lot of credibility when we look to Ultimate Custom Night, the place where Nightmare himself specifically states to William, which directly tells us that the agony that created Shadow Freddy comes from evil that William must have inflicted. This completely conflicting with the bite itself, that led to his death, which was clearly caused by his brother and has nothing to do with William. This then leaves the only option for its creation to be from the MCI, which does have some evidence in itself, with FNAF 3's Follow Me end of night minigames where it's specifically tied to the MCI and is basically recreating the tragedy itself, which Henry even references in FNAF 6 within his Insanity speech. Not only that, but his first appearance happens to be him literally in this same room with the other MCI in order to possibly link them together. Then we add the books onto the equation, where within the second novel, The Twisted Ones, we read about a shadowy Freddy-like figure that was almost featureless and flat, yet still distinct from the shadows surrounding it, this pretty clearly being Shadow Freddy. The main protagonists then believe that the bear wants them to follow, referencing Follow Me, which then leads them to the underground, directly to where the MCI were going, connecting the two together once again. This seems to imply that the MCI was the tragedy that generated the agony which eventually spawned Shadow Freddy, being the event that William inflicted his wickedness. This then makes the mystery a lot easier to solve when it comes to Shadow Bunny. Using the same logic that it was modeled after Toy Bunny to link it to a tragedy surrounding Toy Bunny, leads us to the only incident that occurs prior to FNAF 2 itself, the Dead Children's Incident, DCI for short, the second set of kids that are shown to be freshly killed in the FNAF 2 location within the Save Them death minigame, which can be shown during Night 1, features William as the location's current guard, and features two items that have blood surrounding them which are different or even gone by the time the game begins, meaning the murders happen prior to the gameplay and it is able to be the event linked to Toy Bunny. Shadow Bunny doesn't even seem to be the only one created from the agony of the DCI, with there being shadow forms of Balloon Boy, Puppet, and Mangle. Does this mean each individual toy animatronic spawned its own unique shadow entity? I don't think so, but we'll get into why in a moment. Either way, this would then mean our conclusion for today is that Shadow Freddy was spawned from the MCI, while Shadow Bunny was spawned from the DCI. A neat parallel and a nice, easy, and clean solution. right? Well, as you can tell, this video is nowhere near finished. So of course the answer couldn't just be as easy as that. Here is where things get tricky. Within the infamous Midnight Motorist minigame, we play as the yellow guy, William Afton, confirmed through 5 laps at Freddy's Midnight Motor, speeding home after the murder of Charlie earlier that night. We learn that he was kicked out of a bar named Junior's by a bouncer, the green guy, before eventually arriving at the Afton household. Inside, we find someone sitting on the couch, watching TV, who reminds William of someone else in the house. William then checks on their room, finding it locked and causing him to furiously head around the house to their window, only to see the window broken, footprints of the kid running away, and a mysterious pair of animatronic footprints that appears to have been watching the kid, likely luring him out the house. If we take everything as simple as possible, such as deducing the yellow guy was William Afton due to the purple car being used, and the similar household, which did get confirmed to be the correct answer, then we can deduce that the couch person is Michael Afton, due to them wearing a grey shirt, having grey text, and watching TV. All traits that Mike shares in FNAF 4 and sister location respectively, making the runaway child Dave, the crying child, which also gets hinted at in Secret of the Mimic to be the case. Although this still leaves a big mystery. Who do the footprints belong to? Well, in the Fazbear Fright story, You're the Band, we specifically read about a parent who looks out of their child's mysteriously open bedroom window at night, that looks out to the backyard of the house, only to see her son walking away from the house with a large shadowy figure holding his hand, and leading the kid to a Fazbear restaurant. Sound familiar? This is a recreation of Midnight Motorist, and even resembles most theories surrounding it, where it's theorized that the crying child is lured to one of the Fazbear establishments to find Charlie's body. A stretch? Well, looking back to the Twisted Ones, and as I was talking about earlier, Shadow Freddy lures the protagonist away from a house, through the woods, and what I left out earlier was that he not only lures them to where the MCI are heading, but specifically to where Charlie is trapped, and eventually dies at. But no matter the story of Midnight Motorist itself, this all seems to imply that the footprints are meant to be a shadow, which the community as a whole seems to agree with, since it doesn't really make sense to be anyone else, namely Spring Bunny or Fredbear, which are both Springlock suits and would malfunction in the rain. Although this leads to a major issue. Earlier we established that Shadow Freddy is heavily linked to the MCI, and at minimum the Bite, while Shadow Bunny seems to be linked to the DCI. So who on earth could the Shadow be in this minigame that takes place years prior to those events? Well, in the following tragedy, The Bite of 83, we can see that there are shadows coming from Fredbear and Spring Bunny, which of course everything has a shadow, but interestingly the colour of the shadow just happens to be the exact same colour that Shadow Bunny has in the glitch minigame within FNAF 3, where we just happen to start within Fredbear's family diner. Not only that, but Midnight Motorist itself then seems to reference this connection by having William represented as a yellow guy, despite us knowing he should be represented as the purple guy, which makes sense when you notice that in 5 laps at Freddy's, his car has a yellow Spring Bunny bubblehead, explaining the reason for William being yellow being due to his connections to that character, but also referencing that same imagery of a shadow coming from the agony related to a yellow suit. Altogether, this would then seem to imply that Shadow Bunny was created from the agony of an event caused by William like we theorized, but the actual form of it simply representing Spring Bunny, the character associated with William when causing the agony through the story, instead of specifically having to mean it's from Toy Bunny, like how it was in Hide and Seek. This is even hinted at in the Into the Pit game, where Spring Bunny appears with a look identical to Shadow Bunny, the Easter egg being so blatant that in my Into the Pit breakdown I even incorrectly said that it was literally Shadow Bunny in this scene. The entire basis of Into the Pit is that it's Oswald travelling into a memory stemming from the pure agony that came from the MCI, said agony coincidentally choosing to take its main form as Spring Bunny, the entire game being a giant reference to the fact that there's an agony creature born from Spring Bunny. This is all then further backed with the later games through Princess Quest, where we see that Glitch Trap, the suit literally being a form of Spring Bunny, just happens to resemble Shadow Bunny everywhere throughout the minigame. We even see in FNAF 4 with Shadow Freddy turning into Nightmare that the form of the Shadow animatronic isn't always the same between the games, and seemingly adapts to the environment, meaning Shadow Bunny can be representing Spring Bunny earlier in the timeline, but later look like Toy Bunny when literally in the toy location. Although, to be fair, it's also possible that Scott simply didn't want to make a new model for Spring Bunny back in FNAF 2, since it would be completely darkened anyways, Scott even stating that Shadow Bunny was the easiest model to make, since he just dipped Toy Bunny in black, but I do prefer the answer that it simply switched forms due to being in the toy location, because saying it's a meta Scott reason is boring. It's FNAF, we gotta overcomplicate it. But form aside, judging by the timeline of Midnight Motorist, this would then mean that Shadow Bunny would be the footprints, and was likely created from the agony of Charlie's death. which is coincidentally theorized to happen at Fredbear's Family Diner, the place where Shadow Bunny just happens to start from in his glitch minigame, which that screen comes from the minigame Stage 01, that just happens to showcase a single child going missing at Fredbear's. This then makes even more sense with Shadow Bunny representing Spring Bunny instead. It would be what Charlie directly associates with William, since she would know of his connection with it due to literally being the daughter of the co-owner Henry, who himself is associated with specifically Fredbear, as shown off in the novel trilogy, and the exact image then reappearing in Into the Pit 2. Shadow Bunny coming from Charlie's death is even possibly hinted at in Security Breach with its cutout, showcasing him sitting on top of a single grave instead of being in a graveyard or something similar, which this theory would mean that he comes from a single death instead of the death of 5. This then means that we've concluded that Shadow Freddy is spawned from the agony of the MCI, while Shadow Bunny is spawned from the agony of Charlie's death. A nicer, easier, and cleaner solution. Please? Well, if I wanted to speedrun this video out, I would simply end it here. But that would then be avoiding the issues with my conclusion here that annoy me. Mainly the fact that multiple shadows have multiple events tied to it that could have created them, that multiple of those events are tied to multiple shadows, and that this solution doesn't answer the biggest and most important question of all. If the shadows are based off the agony of these prior events and are even referenced to be put to rest in the FNAF 6 fire, quote,
"This place will not be remembered, and the memory of everything that started this can finally begin to fade away, as the agony of every tragedy should."
then why on earth is Shadow Bunny still around in FNAF AR? Shadow Freddy even referenced in FNAF Help Wanted, and the Nightmarionne plushies appearing everywhere in Security Breach, as if they're all still around in the modern games. This is when a simple solution clicked in my mind. Don't click away or type in the comments with anger when I say this, just hear me out here and let me explain. What if all of these shadow entities are actually one single agony entity instead? The Shadow. This single entity would be feeding off of all the agony surrounding Fazbear Entertainment through the decades, and taking the form of the agony and the environment that it's specifically surrounded by. Think of it, we've never seen the shadows occupy the same space in reality. It's always one or the other. The only times they've ever technically shared the same space is the sprite for Shadow Bunny appearing in Follow Me, although that's simply just a meta hint for the players themselves, similar to the wall code appearing there too, and in Ultimate Custom Night, where multiple forms can appear at once, although that's simply in the mind of William Afton. And so seeing the many forms of the agony creature you've created, that you have knowledge of as shown in Follow Me, in a place where your memory is specifically being manipulated, and by someone else who has also seen this creature, it isn't that far of a stretch. This theory explains the odd detail in the opening minigame of FNAF 6, where the representation of Shadow Freddy is the one who glitches out, a trait tied to Shadow Bunny instead, why Fredbear and Spring Bunny both share the same shadow that's directly tied to Shadow Bunny, why the glitch minigame has Shadow Bunny going through every single minigame / memory, and most importantly, why they're still around in modern day. It's similar to hide and seek. The shadow can disappear and be defeated, here with the FNAF 6 fire, but the shadow will then reappear as soon as events start occurring again that continue the same agony, here tied to the story as a whole. This also explains why in the Fazbear Fright series, Eleanor is constantly referred to be a shadow of some kind, manipulating events to occur, where it's also implied in the epilogues that Eleanor was present in hide and seek, and so was likely actually Shadow Bunny, as well as hinted to be the shadowy figure in You're the Band that just happens to share traits with Shadow Freddy, and having a heavy involvement with the ball pit implying she had a hand in it too, where the agony that formed Pit Trap remains. Since the Fazbear Fright stories aren't actually one-to-one canon to the game's timeline, this would then be filling in the blanks of the shadows, and hinting to us that it's simply one entity that's changing forms. It's also mentioned in the Fazbear Fright's epilogues that she's been killing people for decades, perfectly lining up with the shadows being around for decades by the time of FNAF 6 2. This is also all hinted at and solvable with one specific form of the shadow, Nightmarionne. Yes, the gameplay of the Halloween update isn't canon, since the nightmares must be based off Mike's gameplay in FNAF 1 and the memory of the crying child, but Nightmarionne does later appear in canon through multiple games, and his replacement of Nightmare even gets referenced. In one of those games, Ultimate Custom Night, Nightmare's voice line is even paralleled with Nightmarionne's voice line.
I am the fearful reflection of what you have created.
So would this be implying that Charlie's death is connected to Shadow Freddy? Well, funnily enough, this would then be referenced with FNAF 6, showcasing a black shadowed bear, Lefty, being used to capture the puppet, which as we know is animated from Charlie's murder, and could symbolize this connection. as well as the opening minigame of FNAF 6 featuring a black bear, the minigame itself specifically being based off of a death minigame in FNAF 2. This would then directly link the agony of Charlie's death to Shadow Freddy and Nightmarionne. Although if Nightmare is the Nightmare version of Shadow Freddy, then Nightmarionne would be the Nightmare version of Shadow Puppet. However, in the FNAF 3 minigames we meet the Shadow Puppet, who coincidentally mirrors the crying child's final pose in FNAF 4. So if those two are already directly linked, this then connects the agony of Charlie's death and the crying child's death to Shadow Freddy, which makes 100% sense with all of Shadow Freddy's references to the bite. Then his appearance in FNAF 2, Follow Me, as well as the novel trilogy, all purposefully connect Shadow Freddy to the MCI as well, again making 100% sense with him even recreating the event, and the MCI connection would then add the Shadow Cupcake to the chain too. Although then Into the Pit directly connects Shadow Bonnie to the memory of Spring Bonnie that's made from the agony of the MCI, adding Shadow Bonnie onto the chain as well, which makes 100% sense with Shadow Bonnie also being connected to Charlie's death through the glitch minigame in FNAF 3 and security breach cutout as we established earlier, as well as making sense of Shadow Freddy glitching in the opening minigame of FNAF 6 similar to Shadow Bonnie, Nightmare restarting your game to the warning screen when he jump scares you in FNAF 4, being the only one who does so, which is directly taken from Shadow Bonnie causing you to restart your game when you stare at him in FNAF 2, and the books having Eleanor involved with Shadow Bonnie, while separately luring a child with a Freddy mask to follow her, which is similar to Shadow Freddy. Then Shadow Bonnie's later appearance of Toy Bonnie would connect it to a tragedy surrounding Toy Bonnie, the DCI, which also seems to have created new forms such as Shadow Balloon Boy and Shadow Mangle, which makes 100% sense with how Shadow Freddy also appears in Help Wanted, also under the Blacklight moniker, meaning they can occupy the virtual space, which then makes 100% sense with how Shadow Bonnie can appear in augmented reality as well. Then the agony of Ultimate Custom Night seems to have formed Shadow dee-dee, XOR, and added them onto the chain too, which then makes 100% sense with how Shadow dee-dee is the one who causes Shadow Bonnie to spawn into the night. And so there we go, we can successfully chain all of these shadows as one. But before we talk about the modern implications of this theory with their appearances in Help Wanted, FNAF AR, and of course through the infamous Nightmarionne plushies everywhere in the Pizzaplex, I've talked to a few people about this theory who immediately pointed to the fact that in FNAF 3, Shadow Freddy seemingly helps William in order to further cause agony to the children, while Shadow Bonnie helps put the children to rest. So how does that work if they're the same entity? Well, it should be noted that in a similar event within the Twisted Ones that we mentioned earlier, Shadow Freddy doesn't act in any evil way, and simply appears to take the protagonist to their friend. And then in the fourth closet we learn that William had to manipulate the spirits in order to get their souls into the fun times, this manipulation even being shown in the FNAF movie too, which implies that similar happened in the games as well. So I theorize that what we see in Follow Me is William somehow being able to manipulate the shadow to help bring the children to their friend, which we do know in the novels they see William, Spring Bonnie, as their friend, making sense of why William has a giant smile on his face when going face to face against the animatronics. He knows for a fact that he won't be killed here as the children see him as their friend, and he successfully tricked them just like Henry later references in FNAF 6. The shadow acting out on its own free will also directly contradicts Henry stating that William set some sort of trap here, and clearly knows what's going on when he appears. William was manipulating the entire situation. So I truly don't think this means that the entity that was manipulated to lure the children to their friend can't also be the same entity that was shown to help out the children, which in itself has the massive assumption that the Shadow Bonnie seen in the FNAF 3 minigames is literally Shadow Bonnie, implying that we're literally Toy Chica in Chica's party, literally Fredbear in Stage 01, literally Balloon Boy in his air adventure, etc., which I don't think is the case anyways. Either way, this theory could then help explain the Nightmarionne plushies and Nightmarionne styled staff bots that are everywhere throughout the Pizzaplex. It's a byproduct of and representing the large amount of agony being generated at the Pizzaplex, agony that the shadow would of course be feeding off of. The reason that the plushies are specifically the face of Nightmarionne is in reference to the event that created this entity in the first place. I have more thoughts on these plushies that I'll share in a moment, but either way, this theory also makes sense of the character encyclopedia mentioning on Shadow Freddy's page, quote, will he turn out to be a crucial character in the ongoing mythology of Five Nights at Freddy's? Maybe, maybe not, time will tell, which always stuck out as a weird detail to include, but one that actually gets an answer with this explanation. Although if, like we mentioned, the shadow entity can even appear in the virtual Help Wanted and/or Special Delivery, then it's possible this could even explain the memory plushies from Help Wanted 2 as well. As we know by now, Glitchtrap is the Mimic program, which likely has Edwin's agony causing its aggressiveness and homicidal glitches, that was put into the first Help Wanted, choosing the form and mimicking the actions of the Spring Bunny costume from Pizza Party. That's all about the MCI, and so it has the memories of the MCI connected to it again in Help Wanted 2. But then why does it have a memory associated with Charlie too? While it's possible and equally likely that it knows about Charlie due to simply learning about Fazbear Entertainment's history, as shown to have begun in the first Help Wanted, hear me out here for a second. The Shadow is specifically choosing the form of a Charlie-related plush everywhere throughout the Pizzaplex, as well as using its face for some staff bots. That very plushie then appears multiple times in Help Wanted 2 itself, including those very staff bots appearing in one of the main endings directly in front of Glitchtrap, both hinting that the Shadow is actively involved in the game in some way. So what if the Shadow is actually the reason for these memories that we collect throughout the game, purposefully giving Glitchtrap more agony so it doesn't die, for lack of a better term, when it seemingly should have in Security Breach when we defeated him? This explains why the Princess Quest ending of Security Breach literally shows the effects of the program disappearing, implying its defeat, before lingering on the mask on the ground, the place where a part of Glitchtrap lingers, where the Shadow is able to renew it, and where Help Wanted 2 then takes place, where Glitchtrap tries to take over and spread again. The reason for the Shadow doing so would be because of the lifetime supply of agony that he's been feeding from it through the years leading up to Security Breach, being the reason it even came back to life in the first place in Help Wanted. Either way, through this agony, Glitchtrap would then have the knowledge that Charlie was actually involved in the MCI in order to give them life, the MCI being the specific event that the Mimic is most familiar with, being the reason it's Glitchtrap at all, leading to the agony memories in Help Wanted 2. This would then mean that we remove the agony that the Shadow gave him in Princess Quest 4, a game where we just happened to defeat a ton of what seemed to be Agony Creatures, reminiscent of Shadow Bonnie, allowing us to kill Glitchtrap properly for good this time, despite doing practically the exact same things we did before in Princess Quest 3. Since the Shadow was in the first Help Wanted, it's genuinely possible that it's been influencing the Glitchtrap code since back then too, as soon as it started causing agony to the beta testers, using the same suit of the man that the Shadow had been feeding off of for decades previously, and that created it in the first place. Explaining its appearances in Help Wanted, Shadow Bonnie in FNAF AR directly showing that it's closely following the Glitchtrap code, and it then appearing everywhere throughout the Pizzaplex as Nightmarionne plushies, further proving that it's indeed feeding off the agony being caused by the code, which we know just happens to be spread everywhere throughout the Pizzaplex too, sometimes even through wires that quite literally copy the puppet's colors. This then perfectly explains why the Nightmarionne plushies are everywhere in Help Wanted 2, despite not being in Help Wanted 1. The Shadow is directly influencing the events of the game this time, instead of simply just feeding off of it like it was doing in Help Wanted 1. This also explains the Glitchtrap model seemingly having tears and foaming at the mouth, being influenced by the agony of the Shadow, which just happens to represent itself with darkness coming from its eyes and its mouth. Either way, I do think that the main theory that all of the Shadows are one entity works well, with so many different events all seemingly making sense as being the creation points for the Shadows. It's the simple answer, they all influenced it. It's an agony creature after all. It makes a ton of sense that each event would simply be feeding it more and more agony. All in all, I'm suggesting that it's possible the Shadow was born from Charlie's death, taking the form of Shadow Bonnie, representing William Spring Bonnie for Midnight Motorist, being present as the bite as represented by these Shadows, eventually becoming Shadow Freddy whenever it's around the MCI, and specifically basing itself off of how Golden Freddy looks at the time, due to its crying child influence from the bite, or becoming the toy-looking Shadow Bonnie when it's around the toy animatronics, albeit the DCI itself creating many forms for the Shadow in the spirit world. The Shadow is then somehow discovered by William, who uses it to manipulate the MCI to him confidently. Although eventually time passes and the events of FNAF 3 and FNAF 6 occur, the final fire releasing the agony and therefore the Shadow for now, only for the Shadow to return once Fazbear Entertainment restarts and begins to create more years of agony via the Mimic program that becomes Glitchtrap, which the Shadow then follows around like it did William. And so when Glitchtrap eventually infects the whole Pizzaplex, it causes the Shadow to basically have a lifetime supply of agony to feed from, causing the Nightmarionne plushies throughout the whole Pizzaplex as well. When Glitchtrap is being killed, the Shadow then shares enough agony to keep its main source of food alive in the Venny mask, where the most agony was caused from with the all-staff party, etc., therefore creating the memories we see in Help Wanted 2, all of which gets destroyed once we clear the agony away and kill Glitchtrap for good, leading the Shadow to now specifically focus on and feed from the agony being caused by the Mimic. So what do you think think about everything. This video has been in the works for a while, but it's been extremely hard to script a theory with an idea as big as this in an easily digestible way, and an understandable way at that. So let me know your thoughts in the comments, subscribe if you're new to the channel, huge shout out to my amazing channel members, become one today, remember Game Theory 16th of August 2 PM EST, and I hope you all enjoyed. Have a great day/night, bye.